Hello! Paul Rubens has sent me a set of their newest release watercolours, 48 of them. The box is really pretty, but wait till you see the tin. Let's get into it! Chi Kai Hui. I hope I've said that right. I think it's something related to colour. Let me know in the comments if you know what that says. But speaking of colour, check out this amazing tin. It is so beautiful and I'm so happy to have this one in my collection. I love it so much. They had me at that rainbow tin, that's for sure. It is essentially a standard metal tin for 48 paints, but I love that the design covers the entire outer part of the tin, and it's definitely a showstopper. But I guess we can't judge a paint tin by its cover, we need to know what's inside, so it's all basically your standard white enamelled surfaces on the inside, which is what we need for mixing. There's also a swatch card, hooray! I'll be dealing with that metal flap in a while, but here are all the paints wrapped individually, and there are 4 extra ones, which I'll explain in a moment. I was waving this around because it is actually on their glitter paper, which Paul Rubens has. It's 100% cotton, but it's got glitter embedded in it. And it's got all of the information for the paints, the pigment numbers, the light fastness, and the transparency or opacity. And I'm going to be swatching all of these out very soon. The paint numbers are different from previous sets I've reviewed, so I'm pretty sure this is an entirely new range, and these are not the 5th generation colours. I've noticed there's quite a lot of hues in here, and I think that's because they've steered clear of cobalts and cadmiums, so it's a fully non-toxic set. And these 4 are duplicates of 4 of the colours in the set. I'll just pull those up so we can have a closer look. There's lemon yellow hue, Prussian blue, ultramarine, and intense green. I asked about this and they said they just put 4 in which they think are really commonly used colours. I just thought that was really interesting because you're going to see at the end of this video which ones I think I would probably need replacements for the soonest. Will they match up or will they be different? But in the meantime, I was trying to get these pans out of here. It was so difficult because the paper's in the way, and my next task is to remove all of these papers and to get the pans out. They're poured half pans. There's no markings on them, so I decided I was going to actually label all of these with a Sharpie as I usually do. It's a bit time consuming, but if I do pull pans out and move them around, I know straight away which colours they are and by which brand, so it makes life easier in the long run. Let me just get all of those papers off. There we go, much better. The pans fit nicely, and actually you can squeeze in an extra pan on each line, so you can technically have 52 paints in a 48 paint palette like this. Already I'm seeing quite a few pastel looking shades, so I was really curious to swatch all of these out and see what the set is like. Let's get swatching! It starts off with 2 white paints. The titanium is much more opaque than the Chinese white, so I would have just had the titanium white in there personally. But if you like the white watercolours, you've got 2 options here. I'm realising now it's a little bit difficult to see those tiny pigment numbers and the light fast ratings, but everything seems to be relatively light fast on here with 4 or 5 stars. I think deep purple has 3 stars, but everything else is relatively light fast. I mean, it's very hard to know unless you do your own testing, which is why I tend not to talk about it that much in my videos. It's so relative depending on how much paint you're using, whether you're using light washes or heavy washes, and all of that fun stuff. But let's just go on the colours. There are some really interesting ones in here, and this is definitely a different palette to their previous 4th and 5th generation sets, which are more standard colours. And then there was the floral set, which had a few different ones, but none of these are the same as any of those. They're all completely different paint numbers and pigment mixes, although you'll see some of the same pigments. I mean, ultramarine is always PB29, and they've definitely gone entirely for hues. So cadmium orange and cadmium red pale are both hues, and they don't have any cadmium pigments in them. If you're looking for paints that don't contain any heavy metals, then this is definitely one to consider. It hopefully means they're more environmentally friendly, and I feel like this set would be suitable for beginners as well as more advanced artists. I'm not sure if they're completely artist grade, but they are really high quality, and there's a lovely range of colours in this large palette. Lots of bright ones, which I love, a few pastel shades, and then there are quite a lot of earth tones too, and there's a dark green, which always makes me happy because that's one that I use a lot. A lot of the colours in this set do have multiple pigments. If you're wanting single pigment colours, then you probably want to look more at the 5th generation set. I think that one has more singles than this one does. But overall, this is a great colour palette and I'm really liking it. Here's what they look like once they're all dry, and you can see there's lots of variety and options here, especially because it is a 48 set. There's plenty to choose from. The light red stands out to me because of its granulation, but I also love the pastel shades, the bright pink, the light sky blue, that light turquoise, some great convenience mixes in there. This set also has Davies Grey, and I've been using that one a lot in my Holbein set, so I'll be curious to know if I use it in this one. I can see the glitter sparkling through, and this is the paper that they used for their swatch card. I figured I would use it for my paintings, as I did in my previous Paul Rubens video when I swatched out those large pans that they released as well. Going from a limited colour palette to all the colours. But first I need to do just a little bit of surgery. I find this middle part gets in the way on my desk when I'm filming, so I'm actually going to dismantle it. It's got a little wire going through it, so these are pretty easy to pull apart, and I guess you could probably reassemble this, although I've never done that on any of my other larger palettes. It is a struggle sometimes to get it to come out, but I found when I turned the little palette up, the wire just came out really easily, and here we go, all pulled apart and ready to go, and I can just use that central part as an extra mixing palette and move it around my desk. Perfect. I need to store that piece of metal somewhere safe, don't I? Hopefully where I won't lose it. But now it's time to do some painting and see what these paints are really going to be like. I'll just get a sheet of this paper out. I think it's a 7x10, so a bit smaller than an A4, but it's a nice size for painting, and it's got that embedded glitter, which doesn't actually affect the painting process, but it does sometimes show through the paints, which I really like. I'll link it in the description below, along of course with the paint palette. And any possible discounts, I'll put those in too. I thought for today's painting I'm going to do something just a little bit different. I found some leaves when I was on my walk. These were just laying on the ground along with some little flowers. These are from eucalyptus trees. There are plenty because I'm in Australia and it's the middle of winter, so they were dropping quite a lot of leaves. It was quite wet on this day and there was still rainwater on them, but there were just so many lovely colours, and I felt really inspired to pick some up and bring them back to the studio so I can draw their shapes and hopefully paint out some of their glorious colours. There's quite a range here, especially on these last two, which are almost rainbow striped, and I just love that they have holes in them. They're just really interesting. It's always fun when I go walking to see if I can find objects that would be good for painting, or even adding to a collage, but I'm definitely going to draw these. And I was looking through here, I've got quite a lot of the colours that match. This sap green is almost exactly like that leaf, and then some of the browns match quite nicely. That darker hooker's green looks like it would go quite well. And I think I'll probably use some of that light red too for that granulation, but it's also the same colour as some of the stripes there. The Indian red, this red here, is exactly the same as the alizarin crimson hue. I don't think I could have matched that better if I tried. It's exactly the same colour, and the blacks would go nicely for the darker parts of the leaves, and I was just feeling so inspired from nature and loving how so many colours in this paint palette just match perfectly with what I want to paint. I don't even need to mix. To start with, I thought I would lay out the leaves and get an idea of the composition I wanted, so I just kept moving them around until I was happy with how they were sitting on the paper, and then, just to make things a little bit easier for myself, I thought I would take a photograph just in case I needed to use it later. I do this for plein air as well, to have a backup. Another little trick to save a bit of time and effort was to trace a basic outline around each flower and leaf, just so that I didn't have to draw everything from scratch, because this would have taken a long time, and then I can just know exactly where they're going to be on the paper. I don't have to worry about proportions. It's just a really quick way to get those shapes, and then I can finesse them later with a bit of freehand drawing. Of course, if you want to practice drawing from scratch, then just put the leaves beside where you're going to draw, and then you can do it that way. But I wanted this to be about the painting, so I'm just cutting a few little corners here. Because the leaves are 3D, I actually had to press them flat in order to get my line around there, so it's not actually completely accurate. And you'll see me in a little while going back and fixing up some of the shapes. But aside from that, this technique worked out pretty well, and I'm quite pleased I thought to do this. Then I have the leaves positioned exactly where I want them to be, rather than trying to guess it. This corner cutting really paid off, and I'd put this in the work smarter, not harder category. One last leaf to fit in there, and I've filled the entire page. Now I could focus on one leaf at a time. I've already got most of the shape there, so it's just a matter of changing a few little bits and pieces to make it look more like it's not sitting completely flat against the paper. You could see how there are shadows under the leaf as well, and this is really important to remember. If you want to get a more realistic 3D effect, you do need to add in that shadow, and I'll be doing that later in my painting. But first I just need to get the shapes of these leaves right, because it was really hard to draw around the skinny stems, and I did have to rub those out and fix them up a bit. But otherwise the tracing was quite helpful, and I just needed to move a few little bits around, get some more waviness into it. This last leaf was the most challenging to draw, but having that outline there to begin with really did help. Now I'm just going to rub it all out again, at least most of it, and I started off by painting in the stems. I don't currently have any masking fluid, so I couldn't mask the stems off. I just decided to paint them to begin with and then hopefully work around them. It kind of worked, but I did have to do some finessing a bit later on, and then I could start painting properly. The colours in this paint palette were absolutely ideal for painting these leaves. They had the perfect shades that I wanted. The sap green, those golden ochres, and actually for today's painting I did tend towards the more earth tones, which is unusual for me. Usually I'll go for the brightest colours. And I didn't really paint with the pastel shades either. I think I'll probably use this in a second video at some point, because there are so many colours and I just couldn't use them all in this particular painting. I only did this one painting today because it was so time consuming. I spent a lot of time copying the leaves as closely as I could to try and achieve something that's at least semi-realistic. Now it doesn't look very real at the moment. I am going to come in with subsequent layers to get some more detail on those leaves. I started that base layer with wet on wet, running in a few different greens together, and then I'll go over the top with some drier paint to get more detail. These flowers were pretty hard to paint, but I was able to do so with a tiny little brush, and I think they actually turned out quite well, even though I didn't spend too much time on them or put as much detail as I could have done. But I think I was able to capture them pretty well. The leaves were quite challenging too, trying to get in the details of the veins without making them look really fake. Because these watercolours are mostly translucent, it's very hard to get detail on top of it, like adding in opaque lines for the veins. I just added them in a little more subtly for these, but I'm really glad I painted in the stems first, because it was a bit easier to paint around them rather than trying to add in a lighter colour over darker colours and just smudging everything. For this leaf, I gave the hint of veins by adding in darker shadow colours, and I think I did the same for this one as well, leaving in some space in between with that lighter colour underneath to indicate that there are leaf veins there. It's close enough for what I wanted. These stripy ones were definitely the most challenging. I decided to paint in the lighter areas first and letting them dry fully before I painted any more of the leaf, so I'll just do both of these together and then I'll focus on one leaf after the other. I think the first one here was more of a struggle because it just doesn't look quite as realistic as I wanted it to. When you put wet watercolour against dry watercolour, it can look quite patchy and unreal, so I wasn't super happy with this to begin with, but it actually got better when I started to add more layers on it. I'd used fairly dilute washes to begin with, and then I can build up that colour in subsequent layers. It then started to look a little bit more realistic once I was able to blend the colours, add a bit more shadow in on those yellow patches, and just work in more texture by dropping in darker bits of paint. I was just making this up, honestly, but with a bit of perseverance I do quite like how this leaf turned out, although I did change up my technique for the other leaf in a moment. I was learning as I went along here, and so I decided to refine this by blending in the colours rather than waiting for one colour to dry and then adding another one. This worked a lot better, I think. I was able to get a more natural look, especially between the reds and the greens, letting them flow together and get those more seamless blends. It just ended up looking more natural than the first one. And if you remember, I mentioned opacity. Well, I am using a bit of acrylic paint pen to finesse those central leaf veins, and then I'm going in with the shadows because this is really important. As I mentioned, it just gives the look of the leaves actually sitting on something rather than floating in space, and then you get that more 3D effect, which gives it a look of leaves actually sitting on the paper and a more realistic impression. I really enjoyed this entire painting and I highly recommend trying this one. Here's my finished piece. I've called it Nature's Gifts, and I think it turned out really well. I'm really happy with it. The shadows are just bringing them to life and the colours are lovely and vibrant. I really like these paints. I think they're excellent quality. I'm not 100% sure, like I said, if they are meant to be professional, but they feel like they are. They're lovely and luminous. I was able to get everything I wanted out of them. No issues whatsoever with the paints. Let me know, do you prefer the left or the right leaf? I prefer the left one for sure, but I'm happy with all of them. And as for these 4 colours, did I even use these ones? I actually did use 2 of them, the intense green and the lemon yellow. And here's a look at the palette after I'd done that painting. The one I used the most is the sap green, so I would definitely need a second of that. The Davies grey, I really love that colour, so I used that for the shadows. I've used some of the browns and reddish colours in particular, and I was just trying to think what else. Then I remembered the alizarin crimson hue, I definitely used that one. So having 4 spares is a great idea, but which 4 spares do you need? And I did use the separated panel for all of my mixing. You can just sort of stick it back in the tin like that, but I think I've ended up just putting it in my palette drawer because it's a bit of a pain. I was just wiping off any wet paint because I am going to close it into this tin. I wanted to see if it would actually close with this removed panel put back into place briefly. It actually slots in perfectly well. The swatch card fits nicely into the tin, and I'll just put all of this together and see if it will clip down. I didn't think it was going to, but it actually did eventually, so that's a win. A big thank you to Paul Rubens for sending me this really beautiful tin. I really loved using it, and I'm sure I'll use this more in the future as well. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it was helpful. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up, and you might want to subscribe for more videos. I'll put some previous Paul Rubens reviews that I've done up here. I hope you're having a lovely arty day, and I'll see you in my next video. Swatch you later. Bye!